Hey guys, what's up? Mr. Castro here again. Ignore the part on here that says chapter 13 and 14. This is a presentation that I had made when we were using the old version of the book, and so it actually combined both chapters 13 and 14, but that's not the case anymore. It's just chapter 13. So we're going to be taking a look at the years essentially 1824 to 1840, more realistically like 1837, which covers Jacksonian democracy as it becomes known. So one of the things that we talked about was that from 1815 to 1824, we had this era of good feelings, right? We went from two parties to one party, and so we have this superficial era. Well, in 1824, James Monroe completed his last term as president, so he was the fifth of presidents in terms of being from Virginia. The only one that was not from Virginia at this point had been John Quincy Adams, or excuse me, John Adams. So one of the things that we'll see, right, is the election of 1824. Everybody and their mother claimed to be a Democratic Republican. So John Quincy Adams, the son of John Adams, he was from Massachusetts. Henry Clay decided to run for president, and he is again from the West. He's from Kentucky. There's a guy named William Crawford from Georgia who decided to run, and then Andrew Jackson of Tennessee decided to run. So Andrew Jackson was actually born in South Carolina, but he was raised as an orphan in Tennessee, and so that's why he claims to be from Tennessee. So all four of these men ran for the presidency. Jackson had strong personal appeal in the West, right? So people in the West loved him because, again, of the Indian Wars. Jackson had almost double the popular votes as both Adams and Crawford combined, but he had failed to win the majority of electoral votes. Okay, so the way that it worked was you have to win the secret number, right? So today, out of 535 electoral votes that are available, you have to win 270. So even if the next president of the United States got the most electoral votes, but they only secured 200, let's say 269, they would not be president. You still need to have the magic number. So even though Andrew Jackson had more popular votes than Adams and Crawford, he did not have the majority of the electoral college votes that he needed to win the presidency. So if we go all the way back to the election of 1800, one of the results of whether or not the electoral vote decides the presidency is if it doesn't, it goes to the Supreme Court. So in this case, it's going to go to not to the Supreme Court, to Congress, to the House of Representatives. So the 12th Amendment dictated that because Andrew Jackson had not had a majority, that it would go to the House of Representatives. So the House of Representatives was going to decide. So Henry Clay was eliminated, and the reason why is because only the votes were going to be determined by the top two candidates, or the top three, excuse me. So Henry Clay was actually number 4. Crawford was number 3, but he actually had a stroke, and so he was actually eliminated from the vote. Henry Clay hated Andrew Jackson because he saw him as a rival to the West. Right, Henry Clay is from Kentucky, Andrew Jackson is from Tennessee, and Henry Clay kind of sees Andrew Jackson as a wild card, someone who could not be sort of tamed. On a personal level, he also hated Adams, but on a political level had more in common with Adams. So a meeting took place between John Quincy Adams and Henry Clay. And so according to this meeting that took place, supposedly what happened was, because Henry Clay was the Speaker of the House, he actually convinced the House of Representatives to choose John Quincy Adams. In exchange, Henry Clay was made the Secretary of State. At this time, the Secretary of State, and even to this day, is seen as a really important position, right? Because you're dealing with other countries. So at the time, the Secretary of State was sort of seen as a step towards the presidency. So the decision came in 1825. So Adams was elected the president. A week later, Adams announced again, like I said, that Henry Clay had been the Secretary of State. So Jackson and all of his supporters claimed that Adams had bribed his way to the presidency. This is known as the corrupt bargain of 1824. So Jacksonians were up in arms about what had happened. They called Clay the Judas of the West because he essentially had signed sort of this agreement, right? Or not signed, but he had agreed with somebody from the North. No proof actually exists that any corrupt bargain took place. And even if they did meet and this happened, it's not really corrupt. It's not like the men weren't qualified for the jobs. So people's outcry to this type of politics proved that a need for change was in the air. One of the things that happens as a result of this is we're going to go back to having two parties. So the people that were in favor of Jackson, they're going to continue to call themselves Democratic Republicans, and eventually they'll just call themselves Democrats. And then the those that were opposed, right, to Jackson initially, right, they are going to call themselves National Republicans because they are going to claim that they're doing things for the nation. So nationalistic president John Quincy Adams. Again, he is at the beginning of the end of nationalism with the country turning to states' rights because of everything that was happening. He wanted to actually try to spend federal money on programs like federal university, federal roads, highways, and he actually wanted to build a federal observatory. But again, because we were on the verge of states' rights advocates, it's going to be really difficult for him because the era of he takes over when the era of good feelings dies. Many hard-working Americans thought that his actions to be wasteful of public funds. Western frontiersmen were growing irritated of him. Adams wanted to curb land speculation, so he wanted to make it a little harder to be able to move west because he said that that was part of what caused the Panic of 1819, and so he did not want to over-speculate. Georgians were really irritated with him because they wanted him to forcibly remove the Indians from Georgia. And so Adams was not prepared to do that, and so he wanted to actually be able to negotiate with the Cherokee because he felt like they should be respected as a nation. So the election of 1828 is going to become really important. The campaign actually began right on February 9th, 1825, the day of Adams' election for the Jacksonians. So the Republican Party split in two, Adams and the National Republicans and Jackson and the Democratic Republicans, right? Adams was painted as this corrupt aristocrat, and Jackson was painted as the candidate of the common man, right? The votes were split. Jackson's support came from the South and the West. The middle states and the North were split. Adams won New England. Jackson won the overall electoral vote, 178 to 83. So Jackson becomes president. Again, he was born in the Carolinas, only one that was born in a log cabin. He was an orphan, moved to Tennessee. He took part in things like cockfights, duels. He actually got stabbed a couple times from fights. He is the first truly president from the West, and he was the second without a college education. The first would be Washington. And I'll tell you a little bit about this ascendancy of the common man as it became known, because he was seen as this proof that the common man could even become president. And as a result, I'll tell you about what happened at the White House during the inaugural dinner. So he was not truly anymore a common man. He lived on this huge estate with many slaves. Many Jacksonians, like I said, had poured into Washington, D.C. because of his election. They felt like the common man would ascend. And so for many, they felt like the mobocracy was about to take over the more traditional government. 1832, Senator William Marcy, he actually said, so Jackson is elected in 1828 and reelected in 1832. And for many, one of the problems that they saw with Jackson is that Jackson embodied the idea of the spoil system. So the spoil system, again, is patronage, right? We had talked about this before, this idea that you're going to hook up people that are loyal to the party with jobs simply because they helped you get elected. Jackson claimed that the spoil system was okay. He said, look, you elected me as president, right? Why not? So he actually accelerates Jeffersonian democracy. Jackson is very much a Jeffersonian, but he wanted to accelerate Jeffersonian democracy. He said, why wait for education, right? Politics itself can be education. So his whole philosophy was, if you give people these positions, they will want to be active participants in democracy, and they will want to learn the position, right? And his whole thing was, again, right, he's not a very educated man, yet he's the president of the United States, and so he's going to learn on the job. He said, every man is as good as his neighbor, perhaps equally better. And so why encourage the aristocrats and the bureaucratic class to be in charge? He felt like new blood was needed. So federal officials still remain from Washington's term. So Jackson's post system, right? Throw the rascals out and the rascals in. The idea was, what has he done for our party, and is he loyal to Jackson? So Samuel Swartwout was awarded post of collector of tariffs in New York. 9 years later, he left for England with over $1 million. He was the first person to steal $1 million from the federal government, right? So this is the problem with the spoil system, right? Is that just because you're giving people jobs doesn't mean that they're necessarily qualified or that they're not going to be corrupt. And again, we still have corrupt officials today that are qualified, right? But this was the argument against the spoil system. Then Jackson had to deal with the tariff, okay? So the tariff protected American industry against European manufactured goods. The tariff also drove up prices for all Americans. So again, because it forced the South and the West to have to purchase from the New England states. Invited retaliatory tariffs also on American agricultural exports abroad. So what that meant was the South and the West, because let's say England is selling their stuff here and we put a tariff, as a result, England was going to put a tariff on their stuff, right? And so one of the things that happened was because the South and the West are going to have a difficult time selling stuff to England, they're going to have to raise their prices to make profit, which makes it a little bit more expensive for the North also. So 1824, Jacksonians promoted a high tariff bill to Black Eye Adams. And so part of what happens was they promoted, so John C. Calhoun of South Carolina, one of the things that they argued, the Southerners, was in Congress, was that if they can build a high tariff that would actually hurt New England, one of the things that they felt would happen was Adams would be caught in sort of this conundrum, right? Of if he signs this tariff, does it hurt New England? But if he doesn't, if he doesn't sign the tariff, New England will be mad because they also want the tariff, right? And so it creates a little bit of confusion. Again, I'll talk a little bit more about it in class and explain it. The hope was, though, that it would put Adams in this really bad position and weakening what happens. Well, what ends up happening is, prior to the election, Congress ratifies this tariff simply to make Adams look bad because they were really thinking that Adams would not sign the tariff. Well, what ends up happening is Adams does sign the tariff, and so then, as a result of this, Jackson inherits this super high tariff, and this tariff becomes known as the Tariff of Abominations. So the word abomination means like sort of this awful, right, really grandiose, ridiculously awful thing. Southerners were ticked because they believed the tariff was passed to benefit the North. Unfortunately, they didn't know, right, that the tariff had actually been manufactured by Southerners to make John Adams look bad. The tariff protected the North, and the Middle and the South was stuck with the bill, right? The tariff issue raised states' rights questions. Could the federal government interfere with slavery is actually one of the questions I was asked. So many Southerners felt that the tariff was unconstitutional because it only benefited one part of the country. And they began arguing that if the federal government could pass legislation that actually was detrimental to one part of the country, could that one part of the country declare this act of Congress unconstitutional? Well, Marbury versus Madison had already argued this, right? So as a result of this, many of the southern states began thinking for themselves, right? Like if they're gonna do this, what stops them from later eventually wanting to get rid of something like slavery? Over the southern states. And so this is the connection between the tariff, Jackson, nullification, right, and the South. So this is a picture of John C. Calhoun later on. I actually threw this one in here because Miss Harding, I'll tell you the story about Miss Harding and John C. Calhoun. South Carolinians took lead in protesting against the tariff. The South Carolina legislature published a pamphlet called the South Carolina Exposition. The person who actually wrote it, interestingly enough, was the Vice President of the United States under Adams, and later the Vice President under Andrew Jackson, this man named John C. Calhoun. But he could not actually say that he was the writer because he was the Vice President criticizing the President himself, and so he didn't want to pull that Jeffersonian card that he pulled on Adams. So he actually, in this thing that he wrote, he called for the nullification of the tariff of 1828 by South Carolina. So South Carolina legislature, they sought a 2/3 vote to nullify the tariff of 1828. And fortunately for the country, there weren't enough nullifiers in the legislature to actually pass the nullification. But in 1832, what happened was the federal government passed an even higher tariff. And so this time in 1832, the South Carolina legislature did vote to nullify. And so one of the things that South Carolina also understood was that if the federal government was going to have to try to force them to pay the tariff. And they even claimed that if the federal government was going to force them to pay the tariff, that they would even secede from the Union. So behind closed doors, Andrew Jackson wanted to invade South Carolina because even though Andrew Jackson was a states' rights advocate, he was also a nationalist, right? He was the president of the United States, and he did not want a state to secede under his presidency. And Andrew Jackson's kind of this badass where he's going to basically be like, look, I'm the president of the United States, and you are not going to secede. So he dispatched the Navy and the military to South Carolina to possibly invade. He issued a proclamation to South Carolina. South Carolina Governor Robert Hayne responded with a counter. And so the country was close to civil war, right, in terms of South Carolina seceding in 1832. Henry Clay then stepped up like he did in 1820. He did not want to see foe against Jackson win again. His foe Jackson win again. The support of the tariffs put together a bill to reduce the tariff by 1832 by 10% over the next 8 years, so by 1840. And by 1842, the rates would be back to the levels of 1816. So South Carolinians agreed to the compromise tariff of 1833. The North and Middle states were a little hesitant, but the bill did pass. South had to compromise with the Force Bill of 1833, which was nicknamed the Bloody Bill, which basically states that when it comes to tariffs, right, and really any federal law, right, the executive has the right to enforce even with military. So Henry Clay was able to stop the country from going into civil war with the Compromise of 1833. So Jackson, the Democrats were committed to Western expansion, unlike John Quincy Adams, but that meant some confrontation with the natives. 125,000 Native Americans lived in the areas east of the Mississippi during the 1820s. Many Americans believed that the natives could be Christianized or civilized. Society for Propagating the Gospel Among Indians was actually founded in 1787 to try to Christianize them. Congress had appropriated $20,000 for the promotion of literacy in agriculture and vocational instruction for some of the natives. As a result, the Cherokee, the Choctaw, the Creek, the Chickasaw, and the Seminole became known as the 5 civilized tribes because we had heavily invested in westernizing them. Role and what's going to happen. So in 1828, the Georgia legislators declared the Cherokee Tribe Council illegal and asserted themselves over native affairs. The Cherokee appealed to the Supreme Court, who 3 times sided with the natives, right? Worcester versus Georgia. We have Cherokee Nation versus Georgia. Jackson sided with the expansionists and said, well, the Supreme Court's kind of cool, right? Like, that's good, Marshall, right? Like, you made your decision, now enforce it. As a result, Congress in 1832 passed the Indian Removal Act. And so you can see here, this is in terms of the areas, the Indian tribes, their territories. The Chickasaw, the Choctaw, the Cherokee, the Creek, and the Seminole, they were all going to be moved into this purple area over here on the left, which eventually becomes Oklahoma, into reservations. This is known as the Indian Removal Act. You'll also notice up in the north, you have the Sauk and the Fox. The Sauk and the Fox decided this area of Illinois and the Iowa territory. They decided like that they knew that if the 5 civilized tribes are going to get moved, eventually it was going to come down on them too. And so the Sauk and the Fox actually came together in 1832, and they fought against the United States military. So the permanent frontier lasted for 15 years. The Sauk and the Fox braves, like I said, from Illinois and Wisconsin were led by their chief Blackhawk. They were crushed by the regular troops led by Lieutenant Jefferson Davis and volunteers from Illinois led by Captain Abraham Lincoln. And we'll talk about that in class, really interesting. We'll also talk about the Chicago Blackhawks, the hockey team. So the Trail of Tears, like I said, in Florida, the Seminoles joined by the runaway slaves, some of them retreated to the Everglades. We had eventually what was called the 1835 to 1842 Seminole Wars. Seminole spirit was eventually broken when their leader was captured under truce flag. 4/5 of the Seminoles were moved to Oklahoma. And so again, these Indians were being moved to Oklahoma, and they were basically told they would never be bothered again. Unfortunately, there's going to be oil discovered in Oklahoma. So one of the other things with Jackson, right, is Jackson hated the bank. He believed that the bank was this like sort of moneyed monster that only benefited the North. So he believed that the Bank of the United States had huge power, even said that it was like a 4th branch of the government because they controlled the economy. He believed that it was a private institution that was only benefiting the rich. And he hated the president of the bank, Nicholas Biddle. He called him Tsar Nicholas I because he was essentially running the bank as if it was his own government. So again, these Jacksonians believe that the bank went against democracy, and so Westerners hated the bank for foreclosing on Western investments, right? They believe that the bank was created in interest in profit and not public service. So the bank war began in 1832 when Daniel Webster and Henry Clay presented Congress with a bill to renew the charter. They wanted to get Jackson out, and they believed that if they actually made the election of 1832 about the bank, they would secure a way for Jackson to be voted out of the presidency. The charter of the Bank of the United States was not set to expire until 1836, but they wanted to present a recharter 4 years earlier, again to make it an issue for the election of 1832. So what they were hoping was this. They were hoping that if the bank's recharter passed Congress, it would arrive on the desk of Andrew Jackson. If Andrew Jackson does not sign the bill to recharter the bank, then all of New England would hate him because it benefits New England, right? Because that's where the money interest is. And so those people won't vote for him. The other thing that was done was that if Jackson does sign the bank into law, then Jackson would be betraying the West and the South, because the West and the South believes that he is their president, and that he would be protecting them against the bank and its moneyed interest. So again, Clay pushed for the renewal. Clay was relying on the bank issue to snatch the presidency from Jackson. Clay's scheme was to pass the recharter through Congress, right? And again, like I said, right, it put Jackson in an interesting position. So Clay had forgotten that the best people were now a minority, right? And that the majority of the mob, as they called them, right, was in favor of Andrew Jackson. So Jackson vetoed the bill, declaring the bank to be unconstitutional, even though Marshall in the Supreme Court had ruled in McCulloch versus Maryland that the bank was constitutional. So Jackson is going to interpret it in a very strict way. So he says, the bank is trying to kill me, but I will kill it. The consequences of his veto were that he increased the power of the presidency, if you think about that, right? Because the president was vetoing something that had already been declared constitutional by Congress. He was saying that the president had the authority to decide constitutionality for the people in this case. He was giving the president equivalent power of 2/3 of Congress by doing this. So the election of 1832, what ends up happening is that he still wins the election. And so it just showed, right, that, again, the moneyed interests had become a minority. Jackson was in favor of one term. There was a third party, the anti-Masonic party, who opposed the influence of the Masonic order because Jackson was a Mason. We'll talk about the Masons in class. The anti-Masonic party had also supported Protestants wanting to use politics to bring values back. Henry Clay was overconfident, corrupt with campaign money. The Bank of the United States had issued him $50,000 life insurance policy, but it actually was used for campaign money. And Jackson was loved by the people, so he spanked in 1832, 219-49. The bank was due to expire in 1836. Jackson, though, because the bank was now made unconstitutional, removed federal deposits from the bank in 1833. He went through 3 secretaries of the Treasury before he found one that would go with his plan. Biddle decided that what he would do is he would call back all the bank loans. Well, if he did that, right, again, not everybody's going to be able to pay all those bank loans. It's going to put Jackson in a really precarious situation again. So Biddle hoped the bank would send the U.S. into an economic panic, and it actually does. And so the panic is the Panic of 1837. But by 1837, Jackson would no longer be president. It would actually be Martin Van Buren, who is Jackson's like little pet. And so the Panic of 1837, unfortunately, is called the Van Buren Panic because he inherited it. So a new political party emerged because they were the anti-Jackson party. So Jackson's opponents were angry about how much power he had exercised, so they began calling him King Andrew I. They began calling themselves Whigs in honor of the revolutionary opposition to the monarchy. The Whig supporters are people like Henry Clay, Daniel Webster, and John C. Calhoun. They joined forces in 1834, again, to try to remove the funds from the Bank of the United States. Many were supporters of Clay's American system. Southern states writers offended by Jackson's stand and nullification with the tariff. Large northern industrialists and merchants, and then evangelical Protestants associated with the anti-Masonic party because they believed that Jackson was going away from Christian values. So again, Martin Van Buren from New York, he was the vice president, and the second term was elected as a successor by the Democrats. The Whigs nominated multiple candidates hoping to spread the electoral vote thin and end up in the House, like the 12th Amendment. The big dog for the Whigs was William Henry Harrison, but Van Buren won 170 to 124. So Van Buren was the first president actually born under the American flag, so post 1776. Brilliant man who had bad luck as president. Many Democrats did not like this bastard politician, as they called him, because they said that he was Jackson's bastard son. Inherited Jackson's mantle without his popularity. He also inherited all of Jackson's enemies. Van Buren almost had a war with Canada. We'll talk a little bit about that in class. Anti-slavery had become an all-time high. One of the things that we'll talk about in just a second is what happens with Texas. So in 1836, Texas gained its independence from Mexico, and they became essentially their own country, but they wanted to be annexed by the United States. But we'll talk about that. Inherited the economy that Jackson had created, right? So again, the Van Buren Panic. And his reputation was actually created by Jackson. So one of the things that happens with Texas, right? Americans wanted Texas, but were held by treaty with Spain in 1819. And so part of what happened, right, was that in 1819, when we acquired Florida, we said that we would not try to take Texas. So Mexico gained its independence from Spain in 1821. Therefore, the treaty was null and void. So the Mexican government arranged land grant in 1823 for Stephen Austin, and who was an American frontiersman, and 300 American families to try to get Texas on its feet. All immigrants were to be of Roman Catholic faith and become Mexicanized. So Texan Americans numbered 30,000 by 1835, so they had actually broken that whole 300 family thing. They did not like the Mexican government interfering in their daily affairs. So famous men like Davy Crockett, Jim Bowie, and Sam Houston were there. Many issues had been creating friction between the Mexicans and the Texans. One of those was that Mexico had actually declared slavery illegal, and many of the people in Texas, the Americans, wanted to keep slaves. So Mexico had emancipated slaves in 1830, right? So no further importation of slaves, no further immigration by Americans. Texans refused to honor any of these rules, and they kept slaves in bondage and kept bringing in more. So Stephen Austin visited Mexico City in 1833 to negotiate with dictator Santa Anna. Santa Anna put Austin in jail for 8 months. In 1835, Santa Anna wiped out local rights and began to raise the army to get the Americans out of Texas. In 1836, the Texans declared themselves independent of Mexico and brought out their Lone Star flag. Sam Houston became the commander-in-chief, so the military leader. Santa Anna, with 6,000 men, trapped 2,000 men at Mission San Antonio, the Alamo as it was called. The dead at the Alamo were people like Jim Bowie and Davy Crockett, and so the rallying cry for the Americans became "Remember the Alamo." So General Sam Houston's small army retreated to the east, luring Santa Anna to a place called San Jacinto, near present-day Houston, named after Sam Houston. The Mexicans numbered about 1,300 men, the Texans about 900. On April 21st, 1836, Houston turned and assaulted Santa Anna. Anna was captured and forced to sign treaties, withdraw Mexican troops, recognized the Rio Grande as the extreme southwestern boundary of Texas. When Santa Anna was released, he repudiated the agreement as illegal because he felt like he had been extorted. The U.S. government was caught in a sticky situation. Washington government was stuck in sort of this international neutrality. On the last day, Jackson recognized the Lone Star State as an independent nation. Sam Houston and Jackson had fought against the Indians together, and they actually wanted to be annexed. The problem is that Jackson chose not to annex it because he didn't want to make the Texas thing an issue for the Van Buren election. Texans wanted union with the United States. Again, Texas petitioned for annexation in 1837. Anti-slavery crusaders in the North opposed annexation. There was a conspiracy that the slaveocracy was growing, so that the southern states were trying to expand slavery. So Van Buren was renominated by the Democrats in 1840. The Whigs united behind one candidate, Ohio's William Henry Harrison. Again, he was the hero of Tippecanoe and the Battle of the Thames in both 1811 and 1813. John Tyler of Virginia was his running mate. So Harrison, we'll talk a little bit about the log cabin insider. Harrison won the election of 1840. 234 to 60 election of 1840 demonstrated that two major changes in American politics. Triumph of the populist democratic style that we'll talk about. The second dramatic change resulted from the 1840 election was the formation of a two-party system. So again, we have two official parties again. Both were national parties. The Democrats and the Whigs grew out of the rich soil of Jeffersonian republicanism. Jacksonian Democrats glorified the liberty of the individual and were fiercely on guard against the privileged.